2020 be damned, cause it's a new year, baby! And while 2020 was truly terrible by nearly all accounts, we can all agree that wrestling was actually pretty dang good. And once we got over the no crowd awkwardness, we had some amazing AEW, a Drew McIntyre title reign, a great G1, a Tribal Chief Roman Reigns, and so much more. And in celebration of all that, the top 5 matches of 2020. And because there's such a wide variety of wrestling styles out there and enough great matches to make your television screen shatter, we went to some friends for a little help. So here's Steve Cook's top 5 matches of 2020. Kicking off the pandemic with arguably the best cinematic match we've ever seen, along with Taker's best match since at least 2015, AJ Styles vs. The Undertaker, the Boneyard match. Next was a brutal tour de force, and it makes my body hurt just thinking about it. I mean, like, ow! In a match that was arguably improved by the lack of fans because you could hear the flesh hitting flesh, Walter vs. Ilya Dragunov from NXT UK. At number 3, Steve has a Wrestle Kingdom instant classic that we'll hear a lot more about later on in the video, and these two competitors have probably put on Match of the Year contenders already at this year's Wrestle Kingdom. It's Okada vs. Ibushi from Wrestle Kingdom 14, Night 1. But that's bested by what Meltzer considered the tag match of the year, with a match that has already been included in multiple end of the year lists. We have Kenny Omega and Hangman Page versus the Young Bucks from AEW Revolution. And here to give his own thoughts on his number 1 pick, you know him as the author of the Top 7 series and the Botched series, Mr. Steve Cook.
You know, when I think of the best match of a given year, I look at more than just the work rate, more than just the fantastic wrestling moves and whatnot. I always like to have a good story. And to me, one that stood out in 2020 is all about the best friends being disrespected, Santana Ortiz talking junk about Trent's mom. Are you kidding me? You do not disrespect a man's mother in professional wrestling, or anywhere else for that matter. And when you saw the parking lot brawl on Dynamite, my gosh, it took me back to the old days of CZW with the ultra violence and people getting smashed on windshields, pile driven onto cars in the proper context. You know, you gotta have a good story behind it. And this was a fantastic story. Trent Chuck getting the win. Of course, Sue making the grand entrance and exit at the end, flipping off the camera. That was wrestling perfection to me right there. You cannot end a TV show on a better note. So, absolutely, match of the year.
What a match, one of the many Dynamite matches arguably worthy of this list, along with Kenny Omega vs. Pac, Lucha Bros vs. Hangman and Kenny, Brody Lee vs. Cody, and that amazing dog collar match. But it's the parking lot brawl that once again gets the love in this next list. You know him from his work at Post Wrestling as well as the Andrew Thompson Interviews YouTube channel. Let's take a look at Andrew Thompson's top 5 matches of 2020. At number 5, Andrew starts off his list with a little love for the British pro wrestling scene, with Michael Oku facing El Phantasmo for the undisputed cruiserweight title at Rev Pro High Stakes. But next at number 4, as promised, we're revisiting the parking lot brawl, where Santana and Ortiz faced off against the best friends with a little help from freshly squeezed Orange Cassidy, the undisputed wrestler of the year. But even OC's beat out by another reappearance on this list, Walter vs. Ilya Dragunov in that brutal NXT UK match. And Andrew's number 2 is Will Ospreay vs. Hiromu Takahashi in their false finish frenzy of a Wrestle Kingdom match that ended Will Ospreay's 209-day junior heavyweight title reign. And finishing his list with a sleeper hit besting out the rest is Allison Kay vs. Thunder Rosa at NWA Hard Times all the way back in January. Thunder Rosa taking the world of women's wrestling by storm across 2020, and this is the very match that kicked off her NWA women's title reign. But it's just one of the many women's matches appearing on best of 2020 lists across the wrestling world. We certainly can't forget about Sasha vs. Bayley in the Hell in a Cell, Io Shirai vs. Rhea Ripley on NXT, and of course the women's War Games match. And even though all that happened across 2020, some argue that the year peaked within its first week. On that note, the host of the 411 On Wrestling podcast, Blake Lovell's top 5 matches of 2020. Blake starting his list revisiting that classic match with Will Ospreay. We're not talking about the Okada match, not the Ibushi match. It's once again Ospreay versus Takahashi from Wrestle Kingdom 14. But it's not lonely on the list, because Blake's number 4 is the main event of Wrestle Kingdom 14, Okada versus Naito, in a Wrestle Kingdom 12 rematch that finally saw Naito come out on top. But that's not to be outdone by Okada's match against Takagi 9 months later during the G1, a tournament with some of the best matches of the year. Suzuki and Ibushi, White and Ishii, Tanahashi and Naito, but those matches couldn't stand up to Blake's top 2. In second place, a match we'll get to in just a bit, with Omega and Page versus the Young Bucks making the list again. But first, here's Blake and his thoughts on his number 1 match of the year, and who would have guessed it, another Wrestle Kingdom main event.
My number 1 match for 2020, all the way back to Wrestle Kingdom, and as Andy has already noted, I have several from that show, but the one that topped them all, Kazuchika Okada versus Kota Ibushi. The main event, night 1, and the best part of it was when Ibushi just completely turns to the dark side and gives that blank stare, and from there, the match just turned into an unbelievable, chaotic scene, because it was all hard strikes, aggressiveness. They told a great story. You had the one-on-one, you had everything on the line for Ibushi after winning the G1, and yet he came up short. The performance was still one that I don't think anyone's going to forget, and they just absolutely just beat the living hell out of each other. It was a great match, and certainly one of the best matches I've seen in a while, and the best match I saw in 2020.
Okada and Ibushi could fill out their own top 5, so to make things fair, I banned them from my personal list, which kicks off with the best Royal Rumble match in recent memory. It has a dominant Brock Lesnar, the return of the rated R superstar, and the start of Drew McIntyre's redemption story. But 2020 wasn't just a great year for the Rumble, it was also a great year for tag team wrestling, especially in AEW. In the second best tag match of the year, it's the Young Bucks versus FTR at AEW Full Gear. But there were also a lot of great cinematic matches across 2020. We had Firefly Funhouses, Swamps, Stadium Stampedes, but The Undertaker versus AJ Styles was at the top, and it is number 3 on my best of 2020 list. But that list wouldn't be complete without one Jon Moxley. He carried the AEW title to prestigious heights in 2020, fighting in wars with Brody Lee, Eddie Kingston, MJF, but my favorite was actually for New Japan's US title, Jon Moxley versus Minoru Suzuki, and this balls out brawl. But in my opinion, all of those bouts are topped by an integral moment and one of the best stories told in recent wrestling history. It's Omega and Hangman versus the Young Bucks. It's the beginning of the Elite's downfall and the catapult that led to Hangman versus Omega, Young Bucks tag title run, and Kenny Omega turning his back on AEW to join up with Impact Wrestling and Don Callis. But that's just what we think. Let us know in the comments what are your top 5 matches of 2020, and to hear more top 5s from 411 writers, check out the year-end awards at 411mania.com. As for the best of 2021, my bet is on a surprise rematch. We LC number 2. Give us what we want, Vince.